Lucis Trust, a non-profit, non-political, and non-sectarian organization on the roster of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations and concerned with the establishment of world cooperation and goodwill, presents Inner Sight with your host, Robert Anderson. He, with Sarah and Dale McKechnie, President and Vice President of Lucis Trust, will discuss philosophical and spiritual topics essential to everyday life. Now here's your host, Robert Anderson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Inner Sight. Our topic for today is the psychology of the self. And our opening thought is by St. Augustine, and it's as follows. Men go abroad to wonder at the height of mountains, at the huge waves of the sea, at the long courses of the rivers, at the vast compass of the ocean, at the circular motion of the stars. And they pass by themselves without wondering. And before we go on, I'd like you to maybe comment on this. What does he mean by that? How should we wonder about ourselves?
Well, there are many thoughts that come to mind, but one that strikes me is that saying of the Delphic Oracle, "Man, know thyself, and thou shalt know the universe." In a sense, this statement by St. Augustine is going in the reverse direction, and I think it's true that we do need to know the world. We do need to understand the planet and the divine life that's expressing through it, and that's been one of the great contributions of Western science.
Yeah, that's we in the West are very outward observers, and this is the way it's supposed to be here in the West, whereas in the Orient, in the East, in Asia, the tendency is to look within. But in these images, it's interesting. The images of the mountains and the seas and the rivers and the stars, we're really, I think, looking at aspects of ourselves. These images, these scenes are like symbols of different aspects of our own inner nature and our aspirations. For example, the mountains inspire us to climb towards higher goals. They evoke our inner urge to strive upward and to reach to greater heights in whatever our life may be, in our striving in our profession. Or the waves of the sea are like symbolic of our churning emotional nature, which is always moving and seldom is very still. And then the rivers recall our endless streams of thoughts, our mind, the mind principle, the busy mind, the mind stream, as William James calls it. And then, of course, the stars, they tend to evoke a sense of wonder in us and our origins. And so, taken all together, even though we're outward looking at nature, and we're observing nature, it's as if we're studying the outer world around us, but maybe really what we're really looking at is looking at ourselves, because we see within ourselves these same symbols, and it brings to mind how one we are with nature. And because we have these same elements, we're like a microcosm of all of these elements that we see in nature. And so Augustine was perhaps right in his wondering, but I think we also secretly and inwardly we're really looking for ourselves, that inner self, perhaps.
You know, Khalil Gibran, the famous poet, said that when we discover a truth about ourselves, we should never say we've discovered the truth, only a truth. Mm-hmm. Why is it so difficult to discover who we are, who the I is?
I'm not sure. It's a question that if we think too hard about it, it can drive us absolutely nuts. And yet the self, the I, is at the very core of our being, while at the same time remaining for most of us masked and inaccessible. I think for ages the human being has tended to define himself in terms of his role and his duty, his role in life, his duty to the community have kind of defined his sense of himself. But now, more and more, with the development of a more acute sense of the human psyche, we have a sense that there's a layer, perhaps many layers, of a buried identity that we want to get at, and we don't know how. For some reason, the spiritual path, which is the path of self-knowing, self-awareness, sometimes seems to strike a kind of fear in some people, as if they might lose their sense of who they are, their sense of themselves. Perhaps they fear the implication that it might change the way they see themselves or how others see them. I'm not sure where it comes from. There's a book called The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley, in which he says that man's obsessive consciousness of and insistence on being a separate self is the final and greatest obstacle to the knowledge of God. And I'm sure that's true. The hardened shell around the self is what veils us from recognition of our divinity. Houston Smith, the great religious thinker and writer, said that everything I do for my private well-being adds another layer to my ego and insulates me from God. And yet, if we don't have this sense of ourselves, we cannot know God. Just as the Delphic Oracle said, "Man, know thyself, and thou shalt know the universe."
Yeah, we're so oriented here in the West, especially to looking outwardly for answers to everything, that it's very natural to look outward for God and for our answers to who we are and all of that. But as you say, the inner self, that I consciousness, is what is so deeply buried, and it's a matter of peeling away those layers, like the layers of the onion, until we get at the very core of ourselves. And maybe that's what you say. Maybe that's what we're kind of afraid of doing, because we're going to have to let go or lose some of that outer shell.
And perhaps some people are afraid of what they might see, and yet if you believe that the human being is created in the image of God, why should one be afraid of what one would discover at the very spiritual core of his being? But it is apparently a very different view of the self than what we traditionally think of as constituting our humanity. There's another writer, Heinrich Zimmer, who wrote about the philosophies of India, and he said that what we think we are, what we cherish about our character, what we think is most precious and distinctive about us, our talents, our virtues, our ideals, that is not our real self. It's enwrapped in layers upon layers of the personality, and yet the real self is buried underneath all that. And as we've said before in our discussion, sometimes it takes a crisis to make one penetrate to this very hidden yet substantial core of being. I've noticed that people who have had near-death experiences sometimes confront a being of simplicity, of purity, of light, that they recognize instantaneously as themselves, as their higher component, so to speak. Even though it's so buried within most people, when they confront that essence through some kind of crisis, they recognize it, and they know it to be themselves. That must be incredibly joyful.
It's too bad that we have to resort to a crisis in order to explore the deeper levels of self. What would you say that there is about crisis that really brings out a knowledge of who we are?
I think it destabilizes you enough to approach life in a new way. If we were smarter, we wouldn't need the crisis. We wouldn't need the blow on the side of the head to make us take a new approach to life. But often it's the confrontation with our impending death, or with a deep, profound crisis, that makes us realize that our habitual ways of thinking of ourselves